Well,
Okay.
you had an idea for where you'd like to start, right?
Yes. I thought by invoking the musical scene of my childhood in the 30s, sure, before World War II. And that's again because of the range of responses that we got from the people from whom we solicited responses. And I notice as I just look over those responses that I can sort of come at a bunch of them by talking about things that are very close to my heart. So here I go. I want to particularly zero in on the aspect of our American compositional and our European compositional procedures in the first half of the 20th century, where by the time I was in the picture in the early 30s, 12-tone had become fighting words and was a cause. And it was always an important event, especially in an American composer's life, when he turned 12-tone. And Wallingford Rieger was particularly notorious for turning 12-tone, but he was a commie anyway, so nobody took that too seriously. But you have to imagine a scene in which there was a conception of where music was headed. That's music with a capital M. And of course, in the hands of Schoenberg, what Schoenberg was doing, and he invented and used the 12-tone system in its classical form like crazy, that to him was the way music was going. That wasn't just where Arnold Schoenberg's compositional crotchets emerged. That was the wave of the future. And it's funny how in those days, we all tended to think about music a little bit that way. Like it seemed like a big question, is music going to go 12-tone? There was the concept that became so natural by the 60s that, well, we're each doing his own thing. No, back then music was going somewhere. And there were two very self-consciously antagonistic streams going, which clustered around Stravinsky on the one hand and Schoenberg on the other. The latter being 12-tone, the former at the time passing muster pretty well as neoclassical. And that was because like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring did not count as neoclassical, but an awful lot of stuff that then began to get peculiar C major-ish counted as neoclassical. And just because in Stravinsky's hands things were getting very neo-C major-ish, there was a feeling that, tonal music still breathes. Tonal music. Now, who knows what by then that was supposed to include, and that's part of the story. But anyway, those two branches were very consciously propagandistic and antagonistic to one another, and that did not exhaust the landscape. There was also, as always, the uncommitted, and they seemed to both camps to be sloshing around, lost in vague memories of how things used to be done. So I was, for example, it's back there already, in the 30s and 40s, when I was, going into my teens and so forth. It was back around there when I became very vigorously attached to something about the Stravinsky, Aaron Copland, Brandeis composers, even Bartók with all of his funny scales from folk music and that. I became very attached to things with restricted, odd sets of pitches serving as a basis, figuring that that was all great stuff and should serve as the basis for things. We shouldn't always be hung up on C major scales and the triads that go with it. But therefore, composers like, say, Shostakovich looked to me for most of my life just plain incompetent, because they're sloshing around. They haven't taken hold of anything and made it sort of permanent in their work. By the time, well past the time when I was old enough to know better, I finally began to take in Shostakovich the way I do now, as a tremendous super Mahler kind of symphonic genius.
I might be able to date that because I remember a seminar you did, probably around 1990.
Yes,
91.
yes. Maybe by 1989 I had got the light, but
Shostakovich was front and center.
yeah. And that was just when I was first able to get into Shostakovich as being essentially reasonable stuff. And of course, that's not its virtue, they're reasonable. But yeah, it finally passed muster for me. But I think it's worth realizing that if, when I think back into the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, there were these two antagonistic camps of the 12-toners and the neoclassics or whatever, and it ceased to be so much neoclassic. Like Aaron Copland's piano variations didn't count as neoclassic, but they sure as hell counted as something that was milking the hell out of 4 tones and 5 tones, and that also was not serial, that was milking those tones. However, so when I use the term 12-tone, I'm normally just thinking back there to the 30s and 40s, classic 12-tone as exemplified by Schoenberg. And by the way, as written up in a little textbook by Ernst Krenek. I was interested to discover Ben Boritz is in fact just completing and about to print a Perspectives of New Music memoir. And he points out something that I should have remembered. In the first 4 or so issues of Perspectives, the most frequent contributor was Ernst Krenek. And I remember Ernst Krenek from that time when not only was he the author of this standard 12-tone manual, where 12-tone meant you have a series of all 12, 1 through 12, and from the inversions, retrogrades, and transpositions of that, you make the stuff of your piece, and you can make chords out of it, or tunes out of it, all of that. And that was the classical 12-tone. Don't think Milton Babbitt yet. Yeah, that was 12-tone. And that was the 12-tone of propaganda, and that to which the, let's say, diatonic people were very hostile.
Wasn't there volume perspectives on Schoenberg and Stravinsky?
Oh, yeah, that's right. I think there was. I dare say it was a feature of early perspectives that it was able to talk in a civilized manner about, and in an even-handed way, about 12-tone stuff and whatever that other stuff was, and of which certainly Arthur Berger was a conspicuous representative.
Mm-hmm. The Brandeis School was more or less on that
Sure,
side of things.
sure. I'm trying to think. Arthur Irving Fine, certainly Harold Shapiro, and who have I skipped? Well, of a sort of later generation, very different. Later generation, Seymour Schifrin and Marty Boykin. They were, especially Marty, is as neo-Schoenberg as you can get. Right. Seymour, I would say, was ambiguously in there somewhere. He was maybe even in that intermediate pack of people that were neither fish nor fowl, right, according to the Schoenberg or neoclassical people.
So how do you connect with Brandeis particularly?
Let's see. Early on, not, but like when I was in the Navy, so that's already the 50s, I was very aware of those composers who happened to be at Brandeis.
So it wasn't that you had some particular connection, but you were just aware of that?
Yeah, just aware of them as composers. And then, much later then we started getting in touch, and I went there, and I guess they came here. Some of the responders were a little uncertain what my distinction between 12-tone and pitch constructivist was supposed to be. And I had thought that, well, gee, from my music, the meaning of pitch constructivist that wasn't 12-tone would be apparent. But I think maybe it would be good if I made it apparent. It seems to me, from a civilized standpoint, the term 12-tone theory should certainly cover Schoenbergian 12-tone as one branch. It would cover the tonal system as another branch. It would cover some of that weird scales or chords, Bartók, Scriabin, and probably, although I don't think Aaron Copland would exactly agree to this, should include Aaron Copland, that was neither triad-based or major scale-based, nor 12-tone serial. All of that in a civilized world would count as 12-tone theory. It's all theories of elaborate ways of seeing the map created by the interactions of these 12 tones. Yeah, the people use. And the meaning of 12-tone theory in those days was not 12 as opposed to some other number like a 17-tone theory, which had already begun to emerge, but that wasn't on the same landscape. It's only in a historical sense that I retain any significant opposition between or even distinction between 12-tone theory and pitch constructivist, as I'm thinking of it, which would be one aspect. Now, there's a crucial insertion here. Sort of how did I get to where I'm at that I call pitch constructivist, and in the old sense, not 12-tone. And I should add also not serial, which was a critical fighting notion of the 12-tone camp, that you lay these things out, and now what you're going to do is always be not only somehow working with that order, but literally running them this way. Or, of course, exactly backwards, or exactly inverted, or exactly transposed, whatever. But you're going over and round the 12. This was a striking thing, and in fact was one of the things that drove many of us to the other camp. I was always uninterested in having those 12 notes run round and round all the time. It was a big thing to me, who was already working with little groups of notes and trying to make things out of them that somehow were peculiar to them, like not just finding a way of getting dominant and tonic on them too. No, finding what was really in them. It was a big thing to me. When I came to Princeton, already concerned with things like that, and discovered Milton doing what he called a rational reconstruction of the tonal system, this was a real eye-opener. Keep in mind that, before Milton got hold of it, the way we tended to think about tonal, especially over there in the anti-12-tone camp, there was the notion that, well, the triad is the chord of nature. So in writing triadic music, we're conforming to the laws of the universe or something like that. There was also the thought that, well, tonal stuff, we've heard it so much that we, of course, evaluate things. Like, of course, when we hear a tritone, we want to hear it resolved to the tonic. Okay, that's just, we've heard it so much, we wanted to do it.
So nature and convention.
Nature and convention, forces. And there's another respect in which it was sort of alleged to rest on nature. Well, sure, overtone series and all that kind. In other words, insofar as any understanding of why the tonal system does what it does was concerned, people tended to reach, as they fancied philosophy would reach, for that principle out there which incorporates this, and so that the reach for nature, convention, obligation, and as Milton used to complain, the notion that because something was a fact, there was a certain way you had to compose with it, which of course is a non sequitur. Well, it was a revelation to me to see Milton put the tonal system on a completely constructivist basis. That is, off of three little premises. And don't make me try to remember exactly which, but having to do with generating the whole cycle. I don't know. You come out with special features of the 7-tone cycle of fifths collection. That collection generates, this is Milton talking, generates each interval with unique multiplicity. That was, you can tell that that's Milton. And there was something else. And from this, you put together very carefully something in which you are following through on the logic of certain presumptions And you arrive at those three major triads. You arrive at tonic chord, tonic note. And all of this is not mysterious stuff out there in nature, or that we've just been sold so we believe it. No, it's stuff that, in other words, all our common apprehensions of tonal behavior are alleged in Milton's rational reconstruction to simply be recognitions of the primary structures within this set of assumptions. That was good news to me, and I really picked that up. I even wrote up a manual at one time about the construction of the tonal system, which was basically, it was Milton's construction with a few touches here and there, some of which were really served, filled up a gap in an important way, but unfortunately one of which was off base and blew the whole thing up in the air. But, you know, those things will happen.
I once asked you, were you trying to create your own sort of tonality, or were you trying to recreate the sort of rush you got from experiencing tonal music in your own way? And at one point you said, well, the tonal system is so, well, perfect's not the right word, but it's not something that you could emulate.
Right. Yes. Were you to ask me, well, what's the model example of pitch constructive? I'd say the tonal system. Right. Okay. However, there's a lot of other stuff out there beyond, major triads and C major scales. And I've always been interested in trying to explore that other stuff. And that's why I always mention Scriabin and Bartók, because they also were interested in taking stuff that they thought sounded nifty in the way of pitch combinations and putting those at the center and seeing what the payoff of looking at them as basic to whatever derivations we could think of, what the payoff of that would be. So in that sense, I always thought of what I was doing within this perspective as anti-tonal. In other words, I was definitely trying to get rid of, like the mushy composers did, where they just, anytime they were in trouble, resolve a tritone. That'll get you on track. I was interested in not leaning on notions which seem to me to be peculiar to the tonal system. So that, for example, I was never happy with some idea that, oh, well, here's a weird scale, but you can make this note the tonic.
Right.
No. The way you make a tonic in the tonal system has to do with the structure of the scales and triads. It's not a question of, like, the music hits that note the most often or emphasizes it somehow. No, the whole network makes that a tonic. Therefore, I always used to sneer at compositional instruction, which showed you different ways of making a tonic. Like there was tonic by iteration, there was tonic by, I don't know, all of which, especially if you think of the way tonal music can work precisely by doing other things with a tonic than just doing it like that. Like, for example, you can just hold it in abeyance endlessly, like both Brahms and Wagner were fond of doing. So that the idea that making the tonic is a function of composing, and you can just sort of do something in some batch of notes and you got a tonic. No, it's in that batch, in the construction of that batch, that you get a tonic. So I was always interested in doing stuff that felt to me as anti-tonality, but at the same time was not serial, and certainly didn't look at strings of 12 as the basic thing being operated on or constructed and then operated on. Never. And by the way, Milton and I used to talk about this, and Milton certainly was totally happy with making a distinction, which he would always make, between ordered collections and unordered collections. And 12-tone, now by the old moniker, 12-tone speaks always of ordered collections, and especially ordered collections of 12. And never mind then how, by the time Milton gets hold of the theory, you spend maybe a lot more time talking about ordered collections of 6, and then relations among those.
I've been struck, especially as we've talked through the years and as I've listened to your music, by the idea that, right, there's no rootedness a la tonality, there's no serial compulsion a la 12-tone serial music, but there is a real sense in which pitches are alive and are changing their hues and are reacting to each other in a very sort of situational way. And I was wondering if you'd be interested in just putting your hands on a few examples from your work and showing.
Yeah, let me pick up first on that sort of basic sense of the pitches that you described. One of the things I'd say that I've typically been after always in my music is a sense that you do come out of classical tonal pieces with, namely of pitch space as having a very particular resonance and structure to it. Like, just imagine as a Mozart symphony ends, okay, what's hanging there? Like, you're very much mentally in, say, E flat major. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you're in a very heavily hierarchized and magnetized pitch field with notes which just have a totally individual and different feel from other notes, and that's where you're sitting. That's a different thing from coming out of Schoenberg's Fourth Quartet, where I don't think it's reasonable to say that the pitches are striving for any standing like that. And I don't understand if people say in listening to it, oh yes, they get that sense. Well, I don't. I can't get that. On the contrary, I get something that is more, I think, in line with stated objectives by the early 12-toners, more a sense that the tones have been reduced to equality. Bartók himself crowed over the way that now the 12 tones feel independent of one another and in a state of equality. And now, that to me is no gain.
Well, you use the phrase reduced to
Oh, I did. Good,
That's
good.
a good phrase.
Yeah,
Reduced
yeah.
to equal.
Because as you come out of a tonal piece, geez, I mean, this tone points that way, and this one isn't even in it because it only happens if there's a complicated, rich thing that is exploited like crazy. Yeah, I miss anything like that. And now you mentioned that I had
So
said,
how can you create that?
right, can't. You know, I mean, I can't begin to think that I know how to create anything that is remotely of the richness of the tonal system. So, I mean, that's where we're at. And it could very well be that there's a simple exchange you make there. Like, if I'm going to have the freedom to work with this or that or whatever as basic and draw from there, yes, I may not be able to draw out of that anything like the richness and complexity of tonality. And that is my experience. You know, I don't. I suppose it's something, however, which encourages something different for each piece. In other words, a particular concept and procedure becomes very much associated with the piece in which you're using it. There's another thing, this could be dropped in anywhere, that I think is very important in this discussion. It's a distinction that Milton was certainly the first to articulate and put a name on. The distinction between composition and pre-composition. What we're talking about has been mostly pre-composition. People who were still addicted to some mushy generality that was neither 12-tone nor pitch constructive, felt that there was something wrong with this whole constructed intellectual, you know, sampling out the pitches. What is all this stuff that's going on? And I would say that people who had that qualm and who had that feeling that, hey, you know, you're not working with your musical instinct, and to them I would say, look, Beethoven or Bach were in the position where an incredible amount of pre-composition had been done when they were kids, was done for them. And they could start right there, and they could start, therefore, at the most elegant and indirect levels of approach to this. So that's one thing. I mean, I can hardly be in that position, not only because I ain't bright enough or the material ain't really got it in there, but also because I would feel funny going after the same construction over and over. No, that's for a new piece, let's have a new exploration. Remember, this is very antithetical to Milton's approach, because although on the one hand he did sort of endorse the idea that a piece was its own system, right, on the other hand he would really scoff at sort of idiot systems come up with daily by jerks who would invent a new one for each piece. Right. And he wasn't referring to me.
Backyard inventor.
Yeah, you know, when there was this yeah, there's this glorious 12-tone system, and you know what a joke this is. These guys claim to be, I'll give you one system today and another system next week. And you can see that for the way Milton was thinking, where he spends a lifetime developing this one system, and one, I mean, it goes like this. What makes it one, I'm not sure, but it was all off of the same impetus, and you know, on he goes with this, that, and the other thing.
Well, it is probably an age of precomposition that you have inhabited.
Yeah.
As opposed to, or let's
A
say
culture.
Self-conscious precomposition.
Yeah,
And
right.
so that shifts the ethos over a little bit. I remember when I started out, and I started out as a composer, I had that same compunction that, hey, this isn't coming from inside.
Right.
Something's wrong here.
Yeah,
You
yes.
know, I'm carving away what I don't want rather than welling up with
There you go.
So something's wrong with that.
Well, hey, Scott, you know, one of the ways that I've been able, I had the same thing. I mean, this was in the culture. You were bound to feel that way. You were told that. But one way I've got rid of it is to go ahead and behave that way. All right, go ahead. I will, as I call it, sing to myself and take it down at dictation.
Right.
Well, believe me, you're glad that I never bothered to offer this as and that I switched methods. You know, I mean, and I noticed that more like, another thing we'll get into maybe, especially coming off of Roses, I think we'll get into this. In calling myself a pitch freak, I'm referring principally to pre-composition and ways that I go about things. And there have been times when I wanted to be, like for instance, I had it in my head, geez, back in my deer days, that's with a double E, when people were fixing to shoot deer in Princeton. I had the feeling that, geez, why don't I write an animal rights piece? You know, I would really love to have composed an animal rights piece. Well, forget it. I mean, yawn. Nothing happens. I mean, show me a G sharp and a B flat, and, you know, I can function for a while. But, you know, a wounded deer will get me going in prose just fine. I'm delighted to invent some blab about that. But as for coming into music, no, I'm diverging here. A very interesting thing to me that I realized just recently had another side to it that was of interest. I mentioned in my notes for, I think, Ars Antiqua, yes, that I had at some point, since I wanted, it was in this animal rights mode, I very much wanted to dedicate a piece to my recently dead dog, Daisy, and at the same time to that racehorse that they attempted to preserve. Yeah. And boy, I found in my Ars Antiqua 10 pieces, I found 2 pieces which could absorb titles to those 2 events and really be convincingly dedicated to those. Well, I then declined to use those titles, and I was very aware of why. To me, the worst kind of thing happened. You put that title on it, and now you really hear it as a kind of, a little sound opera of that.
Right.
And that's not what the pieces were. Those pieces took place in their own space within the space of all 10. And by suddenly putting that title on number 4 or whatever, you totally falsified the way the piece sounds to you. all of a sudden you're hearing it as that because the daisy scenario is very convincing. And that reminds me of a sort of point. This is really looping around, and we'll come back from different angles to some of this stuff. But for example, I was reminded that, well, I frequently write things that I refer to, I guess, as scenarios for well-known pieces of music in the literature, and come up with things that I'm really proud of as really capturing what something is like. But I've noticed that I always say to people that, wait a minute, don't first read my construction and then listen to the piece as this. That's somehow not right. And it's especially not right the closer what I'm saying is to the piece. In other words, the better this is, in a sense, the more fatal it is as something to come at the piece by way of, because it comes closer and closer to just replacing the piece. And that's not so good.
Well, we've talked about the problem with the concept of about. You know, how the scenario would be about a piece, or would the piece be about the scenario? And neither of those is, in fact, where you're at, I guess.
And now there are things that I feel I've done where indeed you get a nice balance there. You don't have to insist, which, like my ancient Tchaikovsky piece about Sleeping Beauty. People at the time who read it said that, well, the thing that seemed solid to them was that they could take in the two, the Tchaikovsky and my scenario, they could take them as illuminating one another. They could not particularly be happy with the idea that the one is about the other. In other words, telling you what's in the other. Not like that. And that was good. That's a nice balance. But at the same time, what it says is that by illuminating one another, they are not replacing one another. They're, with luck, intensifying one another. It's funny how these titles that I thought I'd supply just made the piece replace the piece I had in mind, and that emerged out of its piece context.
Well, it would distance itself from Ars Antiqua and become more
just
a daisy thing. Or
that's right. Thing. Just rip it out, and that's it.
And the way you put it in the notes was you implied that there were a couple pieces in there that stuck to these titles in a way.
Right.
You didn't reveal what they were, but you know what they are. So I was going to ask you, have those pieces? How do you deal with it psychologically?
They are a part of Ars Antiqua, and that whole dedication project was just a bust. And
I see.
To hell with it, out.
You've thrown it out.
Oh, absolutely. It was too, it's too offensive. It made the pieces sort of Mickey Mouse something. Like, I think I say in my article with the one for which Barbaro was slated, I said it didn't have hoofbeats, but the next thing to it. And what happens when you put that title on it? It has hoofbeats. Here's music. Oh, that's a nice musical representation of hoofbeats. Yeah. To hell with it. As something that happens within music, I like that. Mm-hmm. But no, if you call it that. By the way, an extreme example would be the Bartók Quartet number 5, the scherzo that goes. I mean, it's got a place that just settles in. And it seems to me that it would really be fatal if like that were part of one of his operas and went with a scene of a knight on horseback. Fatal, man, because it's Mickey Mousing, and we hate that.